guess the buzzer rang. Time to begin. We'll start with a prayer. And is there anybody we need to be praying for specifically? Well, you get to talk to him, though. You get to talk to him. That's important stuff. And we've got the Bible school coming up, or the thing in Cactus too, coming up here next month. So. I heard that, and that's his second or third heart attack. Anything else? Of course, this class, I guess. Rob gave us a list of things to study this summer in this class, and he let us pick from the list, and I picked this Tower of Babel. I don't know exactly why after I got studying it. It was a little bit, but I enjoy doing it because it forces me to look into it a little deeper. So we're going to be in Genesis this morning, specifically chapter 11. But it made me back up a little bit because there was some things that were confusing me. We are all familiar with this story, I suppose, and we'll read it, but I guess part of the reason I chose it was God confused their language and they couldn't get anything done because they couldn't communicate with one another. And me being involved with the Spanish work back here has really opened my world up to things that I had never been around, never experienced. And so being able to speak more than one language is a real blessing. And if you can't communicate, it's a real curse. And that's kind of why I chose this story, because I thought it would kind of fit that for me. But as I got into it, I found a few things that were confusing to me, because in verse 1, the whole world had one language and a common speech. But if we back up into chapter 10, verse 5, it says, from, in parentheses, mine does, from these the maritime peoples spread out into their own territories by their clans within the nations, each with its own language. Can anybody explain that? Okay, there's one explanation. Okay. Okay. Right. For example, verse 28 of chapter 9. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. So did the flood happen and then chapter 11? Or did chapter 11 happen during this 350 years? And each time we see that in these chapters after the flood, we understand that there's things that happened. For example, verse 5 of chapter 10 is in parentheses. This happened as time went along. And so I'm not confused about that anymore, because the whole chapter 10 is a account of the sons of Noah, and it mentions all the cities that were being built. You can, especially in the sons of Ham, if you read down through there, you'll see a bunch of cities that you recognize, nations that you recognize in that were being, it was a process, in other words, it was being built. And then they come along with chapter 11. Anyway, chapter 11. Why was this written? Why does Sunray Church of Christ Sunday morning in June 24 need to read this? That's why I like to approach this thing. I don't want to be up here just entertaining y'all or keeping y'all from going to sleep, whatever. That's not my goal. My goal is, why was this written to me? And I've dug into this thing and I've learned a few things. Let's just read. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As the men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and it got a little letter there, and that's kind of over in the Babylonian area. It's where the valley is, kind of east of Canaan. When they settled there, they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they used brick instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we make a name for ourselves, and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men were building, and the Lord said, "If as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, because the Lord confused their language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Very good point. Chapter 9, verse 1 kind of steers us that direction. Then God blessed Noah, this is right after the flood, and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." That was the purpose. Verse 7, chapter 9. "As for you, be fruitful, increase in number, multiply on the earth, and increase upon it." What was God's purpose after the flood, according to these two verses? Yeah, spread out. That's what he wanted. Fill the earth. That's what he wanted. What did man want? Chapter 11, verse 4. Yeah, that's interesting. But the last part of verse 4 is, "Not be scattered over the face of the earth." They want to make a name for themselves and not be scattered. God wanted them to be scattered. I, in the past, had a problem with the verse that nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Isn't that what we really want? We want to be able to accomplish what we want to be able to accomplish, right? And God, is God against that? Okay, I think that's number one. I made a list of 3 things that I learned from this thing. If you'll look, how many references to self were there here? In my old Revised Standard Version, there was 11 references. This one doesn't have that many. But let's just say several references to self. So my number one thing that I learned or need to learn or still am learning is I see the result of selfish ambition in this verse, in this stretch of verses. Let's hold your hand there, put your paper there, whatever you need to do. Go to Galatians chapter 5. And before I make fun of these people that were doing this, I need to look at myself and realize that I'm just as bad or worse as these folks were about taking matters into my own hands, doing my own thing, and if I'm not careful, then God's off to the side and I'm doing my thing. And pretty soon he'll set me straight and I get humbled. And so I think it's pretty important that we look at the results of selfish ambition. So in Galatians, not Ephesians, Galatians chapter 5, we see the fruits of the Spirit and the fruits of the flesh, or the sinful nature, let's call it. Verse 20, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition. We know all those other things. We don't need to define them. Selfish ambition, dissensions and factions. I had to look that up. I didn't really know. And the biblical definitions of dissension was a disagreement that leads to discord, unjustly taking sides, causes division. Factions was organizing into separate groups for the purpose of breaking down unity. That was what I came up with. What's interesting is selfish ambition is listed right along with those things that, what is that verse in Proverbs that there's 6 things the Lord hates and the 7th is an abomination? Remember that verse? Somebody find that for me and read it. I forgot to put that in there. There's 6 things the Lord hates, and the 7th one is an abomination. And I think we'll find that the abomination, the one that's worse than something that the Lord hates, okay, can you read that for us? Okay, what is the list there? The last one, I'm thinking the last one, who sows discord among brothers, is the one that's the abomination, right? Worse than something that the Lord hates. Hope I'm not reading something that's not there into that. But here in Galatians, selfish ambition is listed right along beside that, right? Right along beside the thing that's an abomination to the Lord. And isn't it wonderful that he came down and confused their language and kept them from continuing on that path? And isn't it wonderful that he gets in my business and does the same thing when I'm not heading the right direction? It did. It says Noah lived 350 years. And just to put it in perspective, how old is the United States of America? Less than that. We're 240, 50, something like that. 100 years less than that. What all's taken place since United States of America was in the 1700s? Lot has taken place, hasn't it? So just to give us a perspective of how all this stuff goes on. And the verse back there in chapter 1, one translation I read in verse 2 said, as men began to move eastward. And so it was a process, in other words. But that's the number one thing was selfish ambition. Made mention of, Galatians 3 while we're there, talks about being the Old Testament was a schoolmaster for us. Galatians 3:24, this version doesn't use the word schoolmaster. It says, so the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But some translations say that the law was put into place as a schoolmaster. And that's teaches me that it's something that's learned. It's something that it's a process that we learn. When I made mention of when God came down and confused their language, because he said nothing will be impossible for him. And us here in the US of A, that's a prideful thing for us. We want to be, anything's possible, right? And we hear all the time, we teach our kids, you can be anything you want to be. And we promote that as being a good thing, which it is a good thing. I can't say it's not. And then here we see God being against that sort of thing, and we've talked about, because it was for the wrong purpose, maybe. But let's go to Acts chapter 7 or 8. I thought I had that written down, but maybe I don't. Let's go to Acts chapter 8. See why I don't take notes? Because they don't do any good at all. That's not even there what I was wanting to do. But Acts chapter 8. You remember the story. We're talking about being scattered. Look, your heading probably says something about the church being persecuted and scattered. That's basically what God has done here to accomplish his purpose. Acts chapter 8. And Saul was there giving his approval to his death, speaking of Stephen, that got killed, stoned that day. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem. All except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. We can go back to chapter 2 and verse 44. They had all things in common. They were all together. Nobody had any needs, and the church was growing quickly, and it's all one big happy family, and we're all pleased about that when we see that. In chapter 4, again, it mentions in verse 32, all the believers were with one heart and one mind. No one claimed any possession of his own. It was just a good thing. And then all of a sudden, chapter 8, chapter 7, Stephen gets stoned, and a great persecution broke out, and we're all sad about that. But God has purpose. Verse 4, chapter 8. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. How about that? I sometimes think how lucky I am to have been born in a place where I have a Bible. We are involved with this solar player Bibles, and we send them out all over the world, and the whole camp sits down around the campfire and listens to one Bible, and that's the only form they have. They can't go back and look at chapter 9 and chapter 8 and figure all this stuff out. How blessed we are, because they were scattered. That's the number one lesson I get out of this thing. The question was, why are we reading this today? Why do we need to have this today? What's it in there for? There's a reason. God has a reason for everything he does. Pam, you were about the same thing? Okay. All right. I don't really want to run out of time, but I guess we better move on. I had some other thoughts, but number 2, I have a number 2 here on my notes. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 11. And we'll talk about the number 2 thing that I see here is the power of unity. And we could talk about it sometime when you're on your own. We probably won't talk about it in class today, but it's interesting to me in the first few verses. It says, let's make bricks. So they use bricks instead of stone, and evidently up to this time they were using rocks to build with, and they used tar. And I thought that was interesting. Why tar? Why don't they grind up sand and make cement and, do mortar like we do? But if you look at the region, in the region of Shinar, it's Iraq where the big oil patch is, and evidently that stuff is just right at the surface. So just side note. Anyway, number 2, the power of unity. Verse 6, chapter 11 of Genesis. The Lord said, if as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing that they plan to do will be impossible for them. What were the ingredients for nothing being impossible? One, language. Exactly. Unity. How about what happens when there's disunity? Yeah, nothing happened. Let's see. Do what? They do. They have to be unified. A church has to be unified. Remember what was happening in Acts chapter 2, verse 44? They had all things in common. And they grew quickly. It was nothing that they planned to do will be impossible type of a thing. Yeah, and that's back to square one. There's a verse in James, consider it all joy when you meet various trials, because you know that it produces steadfastness, and that the man of God may be complete, lacking in nothing. That's basically what the verse says. We all like that part where it says lacking in nothing, being complete and all that stuff. That's what we all want. We don't necessarily want the part that says being joyful when we meet various trials. That's not, I'm not going to invite that, yet I know it's true. And I appreciate it when I'm taking off in my own direction, doing my own thing, build ourselves a city and make a name for ourselves. And I appreciate it when the Lord confuses me in that endeavor. Cement wasn't invented? That's yeah, it's those are interesting things. Let's get back on our unity. John chapter 17. Unity is important. Unity is important to God. It should be important to us. It allows us to do God's will better when we're unified. We've already decided that dissensions and factions are something that the Lord is very much against. But unity is something Jesus prayed for in John chapter 17, verse 20. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message. That's us. his prayer is, verse 21, that all of them might be one. That's a little elusive if you just stop there, but he defines what one is. Just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. There's the purpose. But how is the oneness of Jesus with his Father? Huh? Verse 17. Explain that. Exactly. That would be the unity that we're talking about. But it's extremely important, or Jesus wouldn't have. This is the very last prayer that is recorded in his life here on this earth. I assume it's important. I mean, my last wishes, your last wishes, are something that's real important to you. Unity is very important. Yeah. Exactly. And we do have, for us, we do have dissensions. It's not something that we invite, not something that we want, but it does happen. And how we go about get our feet back on the ground is get back in the Word and try to be unified. I've got several other verses here, and it sounds like we're going to run out of time. Let's go to, got several verses on unity, and just to prove unity is very important, just like it was back then when God confused their language. They were unified in the wrong direction. Ephesians chapter 2, we're going to have to skip over a bunch of this stuff. Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 14 talks about unity. It also talks about building, which is what those folks were doing back in Genesis 11. Well, no wonder I'm not in the right chapter. Now it's going to make more sense. If you would go home and read the whole chapter, it would make a lot more sense instead of jumping around. But the idea here, it was unity. We read that in Ephesians chapter 4. Look at that right quick. Ephesians 4 and That's why it doesn't make sense, because if you get everything out of order. Anyway, verse 3 through 6, he talks about unity. He said, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There's one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, who is over all and through all and in all. Then flip over to Ephesians 2. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace. And in this one body reconcile both of them to God, to the cross. If you read the whole rest of that chapter, all the way up into 4, he's talking about unity, how important unity is. And third thing I found out, was, we talked about it a little bit already, that when he scattered the people out, he accomplished his purpose of filling the earth, just like in Acts chapter 8, he scattered the church. And that caused the blessing that we're having today, because had that not happened, the church would still be in Jerusalem. I've never been to Jerusalem. Have you guys? Some of you probably have. I have never been there, never been close to there. And had it not been for God acting, scattering like his purpose was, then you and I would not have this word. We would not have this blessing. And that's what I learned from the Tower of Babel, that I'm certainly glad that God is in control. And my prayer is that he would stay in control of my doings and my ambitions. And there you have it. That's why it's important for me to read this today. Thank you.